Here we're going to go over my first enumerated essay from my Ideal Money GitHub. It's from this series that's numbered on the sidebar, and they're numbered because they're meant to be read in order, but they're also numbered as a pointer to Nick Szabo's blog Unenumerated. Nick Szabo is widely believed to be the number one suspect for Satoshi Nakamoto, who created Bitcoin. And he's also a graduate from George Washington Law School. And so his unenumerated blog is a pointer to the concept of unenumerated rights. And we can read this from the wiki. They're legal rights inferred from other rights that are implied by existing law, such as in written constitutions, but are not themselves expressly stated or enumerated in law. So they're rights that are implicitly derived. Now the title, Bitcoin most certainly violates Mises Regression Theorem, and this fact compels clarification or resolution from the Mises Institute, and an introduction to Zabonian deconstruction. This word here, resolution, with the hyphen, this is a reference to Raya modes, which I explain in other essays, and I use them throughout my work. Without understanding or explaining what they are, you can think of it as the concept of resolving. So it's pretty natural to just use them and to not explain them. And the second part, an introduction to Zabonian deconstruction, is a concept that I derived and implemented from some of Nick Szabo's work. And throughout this essay and other essays, I exemplify this concept while I'm traversing the subject. The essay isn't too long. If we go to the end here, there's about 12 or so sections. The first half of it will get quite dense and wordy, and I think most casual readers by about the middle of it will be quite exhausted. But beyond that, things start to simplify, and this leaves us with a framework for the essays that follow. For most people, it's going to get daunting. If you can get past the middle of it, it starts to really compress into identifiable and understandable ideas. The first section, Bitcoin and an existential question for the Misesian School of Economics. Early in Bitcoin's history, on the forum where the early bootstrapping development and philosophical discussions took place, one of the posters, named XC, brought up the concept they referred to as Mises Regression Theorem in a thread they entitled Bitcoin Does Not Violate Mises Regression Theorem. I'll just open it here. So you can find a link to the thread here. XC made the claim, the entire purpose of the regression theorem was to help explain an apparent paradox of money. How does money have value as a medium of exchange if it is valued because it serves as a medium of exchange? We, and I use we throughout my writing, this is me pulling the audience in. So we say this as made the claim, not because we mean to scrutinize XC's claim, but because later we want to understand Mises and the regression theorem XC referred to, and we mean to understand the concept in its steelman version, as opposed to a weak put together straw man version. This will be the spirit of this essay and the nature of it. The essay has dual function. We will attempt to explore and validate whether or not Bitcoin does or does not in fact violate Mises' regression theorem, but specifically we will do this through a fairly short process of what we refer to as Zabonian deconstruction. Now this links to an essay that defines Zabonian deconstruction. I wrote it after I did all of the enumerated essays, so it's an after fact summary. And now we'll go to the next section on frameworks and Zabonian distance complexity. XC goes on to cite what he feels is a supportive explanation of his, XC's, Interpretation of Mises via Murray Rothbard, a student of Mises. Quote by XC. As Rothbard explains in Man, Economy, and State, page 270, quote by Rothbard, a money price at the end of day X is determined by the marginal utilities of money and the good as they existed at the beginning of day X. But the marginal utility of money is based, as we have seen above, on a previously existing array of money prices. Money is demanded and considered useful because of its already existing money prices. Therefore, the price of a good on day X is determined by the marginal utility of the good on day X and the marginal utility of money on day X, which last in turn depends on the prices of goods on day X minus 1. The economic analysis of money prices is therefore not circular. If prices today depend on the marginal utility of money today, the latter is dependent on the money prices yesterday. All emphasis added. So XC has bolded the last line and wrote all emphasis added. Already then we have seen XC proclaim their own understanding of Bitcoin as through the lens of how they understand Mises' regression theorem, but more specifically through the eyes of how they, XC, interpret that Rothbard believes we are to interpret Mises. So it gets a little confusing, but this is what we're going to sort out with Zebonian deconstruction. This provides us useful content for a proper introduction to what we call Zebonian deconstruction. Zebonian deconstruction is our construction or reaffirming of something Nick Szabo wrote in his essay Hermeneutics, an introduction to the interpretation of tradition. And I'll just bring that up so we can see this is an essay reference to an essay Nick Szabo wrote. Quote by Szabo. Analyzing the deconstruction methodology of hermeneutics in terms of evolutionary epistemology is enlightening. We see that the constructions are vaguely like mutations, but far more sophisticated. The constructions are introduced by people attempting to solve a problem, usually either of translation or application. An application is the end use of a traditional text, such as the judge applying the law to a case, or a preacher writing a sermon based on a verse from Scripture. In construction, the judge, in the process of resolving a novel case, sets a precedent, and the preacher, in the process of applying a religious doctrine to a novel contemporary moral problem, thereby change the very doctrine they apply. Our example of XC gives us a good starting point for how we can use language to carefully highlight different lenses from which a presenter is meaning to induce their viewership to view and consider something from, and the exploration of Bitcoin's potential violation of Mises' regression theorem gives us a very good case study of the usefulness of Zebonian deconstruction. Here I think it is also helpful if we refer to each source of explanation as wrapping the phenomenon in question in an intentionally helpful interface. To deconstruct such an interface, to separate the presenter's contribution, opinions, biases, etc. from the source material that they, the presenter, refers to, also called their object, then is in some way to unwrap it. Objects, wrappers, wrapping, interfaces are computer science lingo. We are purposefully mixing computer science into the lexicon of this essay and purposefully being loose and informal while doing so as part of our inquiry and experiment. An interface here loosely refers to a filter or translator which allows one to usefully view or interact with an idea, object, subject, etc. Another useful metaphor for an interface is a skin. This is a quote from Wiki. In video games, the term skin is similarly used to refer to an in-game character or cosmetic options for a player's character and other in-game items which can range from different color schemes to more elaborate designs and costumes. The older generation might not have used skins a lot. It's a video game thing. In Szabo's Introduction to Algorithmic Complexity Theory, he talks about measuring distance in regard to bodies of knowledge. And I'll just bring that essay up so we have a link to it. Quote by Szabo. Distance, as the remoteness of two bodies of knowledge, was first recognized in the field of hermeneutics, the interpretation of traditional texts such as legal codes. To formalize this idea, consider two photographs represented as a string of bits. The Hamming distance is an unsatisfactory measure since a picture and its negative, quite similar to each other and easily derived from the other, have a maximal Hamming distance. A more satisfactory measure is the information distance of Lee and Vitania. And so he gives the formula there. The distance measure accounts for any kind of similarity between objects. This distance also measures the shortest program that transforms x into y and y into x. The minimal amount of irreversibility required to transform string x into string y is given by, and he gives the formula. So the concept of a picture, and you take the inverse of its colors, and if you measure that by the Hamming distance, there's quite a large distance between them. But even to the human eye, you can see that the pictures are very similar. So he puts forth the distance proposed by Lee and Vitani, which will measure that based on what kind of a program you would need to create that difference. And that's a better measurement of distance complexity, he suggests. And here I just want to stop again and say, for the casual observer, this is probably seemingly way too much unconnected information. But if we can brave this to the middle of the essay, we'll start to see that we're laying a framework that's going to help us simplify things. And this framework is going to help us for the rest of the enumerated essays as well. In regard to Szabo's measure of complexity through distance, we can say that a wrapped object is more complex than the object it wraps, and thus there is a measurement of distance implied. We can note this distance only implies order since we have no measurement of it. In other words, we don't know how much more complex the wrapper of a wrapped object makes it. We should know a paragraph as simple and short as the previous has many pitfalls and thus caveats required. For this essay, we simply need the loose concept of order. As we unwrap things, we expect to call the object revealed as simpler by some definition of complexity not given or needed in this essay. Conversely, if we wrap something in an explanation, we expect, especially if we made it more useful, that we added complexity. We also don't need at this time to define what is useful in this context, but no doubt later in subsequent essays it will be conducive with that which more people use. The next section, possible agreeable lexicon and symbols. We mean to present a syntax to help the reader understand and keep track of where we are. And so I give an example of this. XC, there's a squiggly parentheses, Rothbard, and another squiggly parentheses, Mises Regression Theorem, and then two closing ones. In the programmer's lexicon, the squiggly parentheses are often referred to as curly braces, and in many of my hobby projects I use JavaScript in which curly braces denote objects. Through Szabonian deconstruction, we unwrap from Mises Regression Theorem XC's wrapper, which also consists of XC's wrapper of Rothbard's wrapper. Side note here, philosophically, it's probably easier to argue we have already in our inquiry implied our own added wrapper to XC's view. However, it's not necessary or helpful in this essay to go into such a point or any similar philosophically implied viewpoints in this regard. I'm pointing to the idea that just me presenting it as the author implies another wrapping. And that's probably low-hanging fruit for philosophers who want to play with that idea. So that syntaxes help us simplify everything up until now. There's a poster on a forum that wanted to express something about Mises Regression Theorem, and they did so through a quote of Rothbard. We want to go into the concept of Mises Regression Theorem as written by Mises himself, and in order to do that we had to pull off XC's subjective view on it, who used Rothbard's subjective view, and now we're going to start to go into Mises' work. So that XC that wraps Rothbard, that wraps Mises, that's exactly where we are right now. Next section. On satisfying the Mises Institute's judgment of Mises' original intention. Although we can't claim a perfectly impartial or unwrapped view, we want to understand Mises' regression theorem by Mises' sincere intent of it. We want Mises, if he were here today, to approve of our application of his idea in regard to our inquiry into whether or not Bitcoin violates the principle he explains. XC and Rothbard may not have given or used a framework to view Mises' regression theorem that Mises would approve of. And so we have to take great caution in how we tease out Mises' intentions from his text. Here we have an appropriate dual-functioning judge on the accuracy of our finding, but one that is only unbiased for sure in a certain sense. That if the proclaimed school of Mises' work, i.e. the Mises Institute, that claims to follow his insights, can say that we have understood and apply Mises' work in a satisfactory manner, and most especially if they agree that Bitcoin violates Mises' regression theorem such that there is a revision or invalidation needed to resolve, to bring resolution with, the truth of nature, I think it can be affirmed at the very least that a useful Zebonian deconstruction has been made and that a new construction is or was needed, regardless of the outcome of a Mises Institute clarification. Of course, if the school happened to be nefarious or self-serving before truth and reason, or had a difficulty facing that the truth of nature was such that something in their founding doctrine is obviously invalid, they could just claim in this essay we have applied an invalid construction that Mises wouldn't have approved of. Here, however, truth and justice to reason do not go unguarded, because they have to convince all the impartial observers, the general audience I write to now, that our deconstruction was an unjust construction. In other words, we're pulling away the layers trying to get to the truth of Mises' true intentions. And so we're claiming that we're deconstructing. The Mises Institute can come in and say, no, you've actually added things that he didn't mean, and suggest that we're doing a construction. Next section. In Mises' own words, but translated into English, but while he was alive and after he revised. Obviously, we want to refer to Mises' own words. However, we must note that not only are we traversing the context of culture and time, but Mises originally wrote The Theory of Money and Credit in German, and it was translated into English. Although Mises was alive and made later revisions such that it seems he was able to supervise the translation to the extent that he did. In this essay, we feel we make a case satisfactory to the general reader and the Mises Institute that the translation component doesn't affect our ability to understand Mises' regression theory. As a side note, we can illuminate more wrappers for practice since they have arisen for us as examples. So the theory of credit, but translated from German to English, and we can use our syntax here and say English translation wraps the theory of credit. And a writing of Mises commentating on the translation of his work, which we have, so that's Mises' judgment, wraps the English translation, which wraps the theory of credit. Next section. Wrapping Mises' regression theorem with the context of the want of approval of concordance and utility from our three judges as a shortcut. We know that we want to satisfy the general reader, Mises, and the Mises Institute with our understanding and application of Mises' regression theorem, and so we can use their approval as our shortcut. How we know there is this shortcut is the author's efforts of observing others' efforts, not presented in this essay, but it is our conjecture that we can start at a place that will satisfy, most importantly, the present-day authority on the subject, the Mises Institute, by invoking and explaining this quote. Quote from Mises: "If all the exchange ratios of the past were erased from human memory, the process of market price determination might certainly become more difficult, because everybody would have to construct a new scale of valuations for himself. But it would not become impossible. In fact, people the whole world over are engaged daily and hourly in the operation from which all prices result. The decision as to the relative significance enjoyed by specific quantities of goods as conditions for the satisfaction of wants. Here it is our wrapper to suggest Mises was previously building up an argument that he summarizes here, which suggests that a market can rebuild its prices from scratch, because he is later going to make a contrast to this point in regard to money. A wrapper we feel our three important judges would approve of and find useful. Later, Mises begins to expound on the idea that the objective exchange value of money, or what the general reader might better understand as purchasing power, hopefully the Mises Institute agrees with this comparison of phrases. The objective exchange value of money is determined in the market where money is exchanged for commodities and commodities for money. Quote by Mises. It is our wrapper to suggest that Mises extends the marginal utility theory to point out and eventually resolve an apparent problem of circularity that arises. First, we present the quote and then we will summarize. Thus, the general reader can trust our summary to the judgment of the Mises Institute as a computational shortcut to traversing the difficult wording of Mises' work. Quote by Mises. The marginal utility theory attempts to base the exchange value of goods on the degree of their utility to the individual. The degree of utility of money to the individual quite obviously depends on its exchange value, since money can have utility only if it has exchange value, and the degree of the utility is determined by the level of the exchange value. Money is valued subjectively according to the amount of consumable goods that can be obtained in exchange for it, or according to what other goods have to be given in order to obtain the money needed for making the payments. The marginal utility of money to any individual, that is, the marginal utility derivable from the goods that can be obtained with the given quantity of money or that must be surrendered for the required money, presupposes a certain exchange value of the money so that the latter cannot be derived from the former. Mises is responding to the observation that 1. Money is subject to the same universal laws as other market goods, and 2. Our want of money comes from the amount of market goods it buys. But how does money attract our want for it if we don't know the amount of goods it buys beforehand? It is Mises' Regression Theorem that addresses and resolves this apparent circularity. Quote, those who have realized the significance of historically transmitted values in the determination of the objective exchange value of money will not find great difficulty in escaping this apparently circular argument. To this, he introduces the concept of price continuity, from the time of money function as a commodity to the point at which it is observed as money. Quote, once an exchange ratio between money and commodities has been established in the market, it continues to exercise an influence beyond the period during which it is maintained. It provides the basis for the further valuation of money. Thus, the past objective exchange value of money has a certain significance for its present and future valuation. The money prices of today are linked with those of yesterday and before, and with those of tomorrow and after. He solidifies the idea that money works on a continuum of prices, necessary to regress the origin of its value to its nature, and as an otherwise useful, non-monetary commodity. Quote, to demand of a theory the value of money that it should explain the exchange ratio between money and commodities solely with reference to the monetary function and without the assistance of the element of historical continuity in the value of money is to make demands of it that run quite contrary to its nature and its proper task. We've now gotten to the part of the essay where things start to get easier and readily understandable. On the section of the theory of credit entitled The Necessity for a Value Independent of the Monetary Function Before an Object Can Serve as Money. We want to reference a section of Mises, but the reference is long, so here we present it in block quote form. The Theory of Money and Credit, Part 2, The Value of Money, Chapter 8, The Determinants of the Objective Exchange Value or Purchasing Power of Money, would be maybe section 1, the element of continuity in the objective exchange value of money, and the second part of that section, the necessity for a value independent of the monetary function before an object can serve as a money. So that's just a reference to where this comes from. In this section, Mises writes, quote, "If the objective exchange value of a money must always be linked with the pre-existing market exchange value between money and other economic goods, since otherwise individuals would not be in a position to estimate the value of the money, it follows that an object cannot be used as money unless, at the moment when its use as money begins, it already possesses an objective exchange value based on some other use. This provides both a refutation of those theories which derive the origin of money from a general agreement to impute fictitious value to things intrinsically valueless, and a confirmation of Menger's hypothesis concerning the origin of the use of money." Notice the reasoning in the parentheses, which itself is almost a construction that helps us accurately frame Mises' theorem. That is, since otherwise individuals would not be in a position to estimate the value of money. Next section, on the Misesian wrapping of the Lockean theory of the intrinsic value of money. In that previous quote, there is a citation attached that is a reference to Locke. 4. Thus Locke, some considerations of the consequences of the lowering interest and the raising of the value of money. He attaches this citation to the word valueless in this sentence of the previous quote. This provides both a refutation of those theories which derive the origin of money from a general agreement to impute fictitious value to things intrinsically valueless, and that's where he cites Locke, and a confirmation of Menger's hypothesis concerning the origin of money. Here we can attempt to make a Zebonian deconstruction of Mises, who Locke wraps money, that our three judges would hopefully approve of, although we are probably running into computational limits, or in other words, we might be worried that Locke will send us on more deconstruction efforts in order to understand his point to our three judges' satisfaction, and also to Locke's satisfaction and his school's satisfaction. So Mises has cited Locke, and now we want to see what he's referencing there, and we're worried Locke's going to cite someone and that we also have to appease Locke's students. So we're going to kind of just wrap that up, and so we can move on without going too far into that, but we'll address it a little bit here. It seems maybe Mises is referring to this sentiment of Locke's. We expect to be corrected by our judges otherwise. Quote by Locke: "For mankind, having consented to put an imaginary value upon gold and silver by reason of their durableness, scarcity, and not being very liable to be counterfeited, have made them by general consent the common pledges, whereby men are assured, in exchange for them, to receive equally valuable things to those they parted with for any quantity of these metals, by which means it comes to pass that the intrinsic value regarded in these metals, made the common barter, is nothing but the quantity which men give or receive of them. For they having as money no other value but as pledges to procure what one wants or desires, and they procuring what we want or desire only by their quantity, 'tis evident that the intrinsic value of silver and gold used in commerce is nothing but their quantity." By the experience of this author, that's me, this essay calls for a deconstruction of Locke's use of the word quantity. And here we can take an interesting shortcut by feeling that ChatGTP version 4 Turbo will satisfy the 5 judges, R3, which is our general reader, Mises and the Mises Institute, and including Locke, if he could judge, and anyone from his school of thinking or familiar with his work that is sincere. Firstly, of the preceding paragraph, ChatGTP explains. Locke delves into the reason behind the value attributed to gold and silver. He points out that mankind has agreed to assign an imaginary value to these metals due to their durability, scarcity, and resistance to counterfeiting. This general consensus has made gold and silver the common pledges in trade, assuring individuals that they can exchange these metals for items of equal value. The intrinsic value of these metals in commerce, according to Locke, is not derived from any inherent quality, but solely from their quantity. Then we ask ChatGPT, what is the definition of quantity in this sense? The term quantity refers to the physical amount or volume of these metals. When Locke mentions that the intrinsic value of silver and gold used in commerce is nothing but their quantity, he means that the value of these metals as money is determined by how much of them there is, not by any inherent quality or characteristic. This concept is significant in the history of economic thought. It reflects an early understanding that the value of money, especially in the form of precious metals, is a function of its scarcity and the demand for it, rather than any intrinsic utility or use value those metals might have. So that's ChatGPT wrapping Locke, who wraps the quantity theory of money. And it refers to acknowledging that the amount of units of a medium of money affects its purchasing power. From a certain context or with a certain wrapper, it might make sense to observe the nature of money or a money medium with the lexicon that suggests that which is money has no use value. That would be a definitional statement. Fortunately for us, such a venture is not useful for our inquiry, but it further exemplifies our framework and properly invites the Lockeans, along with the Misesians, to make relevant fatal complaints to our inquiry. Then what we've shown here is Mises is presenting his regression theory in contrast to Locke's quantity theory of money. On the Misesian wrapping of Menger and the origins of money. In the previous quote from Mises, he finishes by declaring it to be a confirmation of Menger's hypothesis concerning the origin of the use of money. In regard to Menger's origin of money and our now apparent need to traverse it, we are able to take a computational shortcut in the form of a citation from the works. And this is from The Origin of Money. It is not impossible for media of exchange, serving as they do the common weal in the most emphatic sense of the word, to be instituted also by way of legislation, like other social institutions. But this is neither the only nor the primary mode in which money has taken its origin. From referencing Menger's framework, it seems that at least the general observer would be easily convinced that the origins of money are not at all confined to arising from its origin as a commodity. It might also be argued too that Menger doesn't mean to argue, at least from the view of the quote above, that money came from a medium that was first a commodity. However, it seems that Mises meant to say that Menger was suggesting that money first arose from something that was a commodity with a previously established market price. Thus, the three judges, admittedly, we only really consult Mises as a judge through examining his work, then need to opine on whether this is a fair representation of what Mises implied of Menger and whether or not Menger's arguments support this representation. Next section, our wrapped representation of Mises Regression Theorem, or the satisfactory representation of it. The logic behind the theorem is very well and succinctly captured in this paragraph. Another assertion to be judged. Quote, if the objective exchange value of money must always be linked with the pre-existing market exchange ratio between money and other economic goods, since otherwise individuals would not be in a position to estimate the value of money, it follows that an object cannot be used as money unless, at the moment when its use as money begins, it already possesses an objective exchange value based on some other use. Mises feels it's self-supported that the objective exchange value of money must always be linked with the pre-existing market exchange ratio between money and other goods, because otherwise individuals would not be in a position to estimate the value of money. He deduces an object cannot be used as money unless it already has such a value. It seems fair to say then that Mises believed this framework logically asserts, quote, the necessity for a value independent of the monetary function before an object can serve as money. Reductio ad absurdum and Mises Regression Theorem. It seems then, barring proper contention on the previous observation and deconstructions, we can continue on in our inquiry from a reductio ad absurdum framework. If we find Bitcoin to in fact be a money, and that it did not at one time previously have a commodity-based market value, then Mises Regression Theorem is invalid in the form we are viewing it in. The question of what could be done about this highlights the purpose of building up this exploration. Of course, it could be said that Bitcoin isn't money, either isn't yet and never will be. Then there would perhaps be an inquiry or deconstruction needed into Mises' definition of money. It would be a nice shortcut if the Misesian school simply agreed that Bitcoin is in fact money and that by their account Mises would approve of this wrapper or extension of his work. If the Austrian or Misesian school tries to argue Bitcoin isn't money, it would be a strange declaration, however, since they are the school that make the very strong assertion that government-declared money is barely money at all and certainly not the requirement for it. Furthermore, there is no chance of the learned Misesian saying that money is only that which government declares it to be, because it is well known it is part of the foundational argument of the school of thought that that isn't true. Moreover, if Bitcoin isn't a money, that you can buy things with it and that it has a well-established exchange price in every market, would then mean it must have a commodity, i.e. non-monetary, based market valuation. It would still be up to the Misesian, defending the regression theorem, to show that such a valuation is not a money-based valuation, but a commodity-based one. The job to satisfy the inquiry of whether or not Bitcoin breaks Mises' regression theorem would be the same. Find a non-monetary use case, else it seems likely the part of the judge, that is the general audience, would admit even Mises would have to repent. How well would the argument sit with the general audience that Bitcoin simply must have a non-monetary use case, but that no one can show what it is, and it seems easier to argue that it doesn't? How did such a use case create a market value for market participants if no one knows what that use case was? At the root and heart of Misesian theory, based in praxeology, a word we will explore later, you cannot prove that Bitcoin is a money simply because it has a price, regardless that the Misesians can't come up with a non-money based use case. However, we also suggest it would be really hard to convince an impartial observer that Bitcoin isn't a money by the Misesian school's definition if they spent any amount of time with Mises' works. Note, we mean to Zibonian deconstruct money in a subsequent essay and include an inquiry into the Misesian definition of it. Although such effort is not likely to be expended, it's not necessary anyways. If Bitcoin is a money by the Misesian definition, and if the Misesian school were to bend the truth to save face and judge and declare Bitcoin was not a money, they would shoot themselves in the foot, especially if they feel their school is superior in the face of nature. In this sense, it seems predictable that wisdom will not let youth do such a thing. Then our reductio ad absurdum reduces to showing that Bitcoin had no non-monetary commodity value before it became a money. Next section. When did Bitcoin get a price? When or did Bitcoin become a money? On May 18th, 2010, user Laszlo posted an open trade of Bitcoin for pizza. This is on the Bitcoin forum. Quote, I'll pay 10,000 Bitcoins for a couple of pizzas, like maybe 2 large ones so I have some left over for the next day. I like having leftover pizza to nibble on later. You can make the pizza yourself and bring it to my house or order it for me from a delivery place. But what I'm aiming for is getting food delivered in exchange for Bitcoins where I don't have to order or prepare it myself, kind of like ordering a breakfast platter at a hotel or something. They just bring you something to eat and you're happy. I like things like onions, peppers, sausage, mushrooms, tomatoes, pepperoni, etc. Just standard stuff, no weird fish toppings or anything like that. I also like regular cheese pizzas, which may be cheaper to prepare or otherwise acquire. If you're interested, please let me know and we can work out a deal. Thanks. Laszlo. There are a few things to note. Firstly, the offer is open to bargain with, although it's certain that Laszlo has some idea in his mind about the value of his Bitcoin. This suggests that there can't be said to be an established price to Bitcoin in any significant sense that would be confirmable by the sentiments from that time and now. Going back to our encapsulation of Mises Regression Theorem, we want to observe this in regard to the bolded. End quote. If this objective exchange value of money must always be linked with a pre-existing market exchange ratio between money and other economic goods, this is the bolded part, since otherwise individuals would not be in a position to estimate the value of the money. Laszlo's famous transaction wasn't the first Bitcoin transaction in exchange for something of value, and it's not for us to reason that this was the moment it became a money. There's no doubt that this wouldn't be perfectly palatable for the general audience, the Mises Institute nor Mises. But it's hard to agree with the idea that Laszlo, if he didn't have the exchange value of Bitcoin in this scenario, wasn't in a position to estimate the value of his money. He certainly posted the range of his own estimate in a time when there was no real established price for Bitcoin. How does the general reader feel about the implied assertion that by Mises that Laszlo wasn't able to estimate the value of his Bitcoin without a previous valuation of it? How does that resolve with Mises stating, quote, "It follows that an object cannot be used as money unless at the moment when its use as money begins, it already possesses an objective exchange value based on some other use." Furthermore, can the general reader be convinced it's otherwise a game of semantics to suggest that when Laszlo paid for his pizzas, he wasn't using Bitcoin as money? There are many explanations and contentions that the Misesian might reach for, but for the general reader's sake and for brevity in regard to the dual nature of this essay, we shall compress them later into their own section. The charge that the Misesian school must respond to. In order to extend Szabo's concept of deconstruction and the formalization of the measurement of the value of complexity, it is helpful to reduce our inquiry into the effects of the existence of Bitcoin on the assertions of the Misesian school of economic thought, and specifically with regard to the regression theorem, we put forth the following. 1. Mises put forth a theorem we refer to as Mises Regression Theorem that says, in effect, a money medium must have a previous non-money nature to it. 2. A medium considered as money by the Misesian definition that exists must necessarily have a non-monetary based origin to its valuation, or it breaks the regression theorem. 3. Bitcoin doesn't have a non-monetary based market value. 4. Bitcoin breaks Mises Regression Theorem, calling for necessary Rhea solution, which is a word we intend to expound on in another essay, from the Misesian school of thought. Rhea visiting the propriety of action. This charge, to be defended, ignites an interesting experiment to observe as the Misesian school struggles to resolve the apparent discordance that the general reader will no doubt see. If left unresolved, then a general reader cannot sympathize with the school and its uselessness, as opposed to a general usefulness, and this will cause it to fall out of favor and history. Left undefended, Bitcoin will have defeated it. Szabonian construction and ways to defend the Misesian school versus the existence of Bitcoin, and the apparent discordance with Mises Regression Theorem and observable nature. Szabo got the idea of construction-deconstruction we are referring to from objects he wrapped. Our phrase, Szabonian construction, is our wrapper or our interpretation, evolution, and useful application of his ideas in this regard. The Szabonian aspect speaks to how the construction of our inquiry, or how the presentation of the argument of this essay aligns with Szabo's work. But in this essay, this is more done by example rather than explaining how or why the examples are relevant. Szabo gives us an explanation and some ideas for resolving the discordance of objects. Quote, Analyzing the deconstruction methodology of hermeneutics in terms of evolutionary epistemology is enlightening. We see that constructions are vaguely like mutations, but far more sophisticated. The constructions are introduced by people attempting to solve a problem, usually either of translation or application. An application is the end use of a traditional text, such the judge applying the law to a case, or a preacher writing a sermon based on a verse from Scripture. In construction, the judge, in the process of resolving a novel case, sets a precedent, and the preacher, in the process of applying a religious doctrine to a novel contemporary moral problem, thereby changing the very doctrine they apply. Thus, the Darwinian process of selection between traditions is accompanied by a Lamarckian process of accumulation and distortion of tradition in the process of solving specific problems. We might expect some constructions to advance a political ideology or to be biased by the sexist or racist psychology of the translator or applicator, as some of Derrida's followers would have it. However, these kinds of constructions can be subsumed under two additional constructions suggested by the evolutionary methodology: synthesis and biomotivation. Synthetic construction consists of one or more of the development of a new element that synthesizes traditions, the synthesis of texts or parts of texts into new texts which incorporate such synthesis. Satoshi's opinion on the necessity for a value independent of the monetary function before an object can serve as money. Obviously, Satoshi's authority and opinion should have no bearing on reason, but it's interesting and specific to note that Satoshi did not agree with Mises Regression Theorem by the interpretation and implication that a money must necessarily have had a non-monetary market value before it became a money. Now, this quote is from Satoshi on the Bitcoin forum. As a thought experiment, imagine there was a base metal as scarce as gold, but with the following properties: boring gray in color, not a good conductor of electricity, not particularly strong, but not ductile or easily malleable either, not useful for any practical or ornamental purpose, and one special magical property: can be transported over a communications channel. If it somehow acquired any value at all for whatever reason, then anyone wanting to transfer wealth over a long distance could buy some, transmit it, and have the recipient sell it. Maybe it could get an initial value circularly, as you've suggested, by people foreseeing it potential usefulness for exchange. I would definitely want some. Maybe collectors, any random reason could spark it. I think the traditional qualifications for money were written with the assumption that there are so many competing objects in the world that are scarce, an object with the automatic bootstrap of intrinsic value will surely win out over those without intrinsic value. But if there were nothing in the world with intrinsic value that could be used as money, only scarce but no intrinsic value, I think people would still take something up. I'm using the word scarce here to only mean limited in potential supply. Perhaps, too, judges can take note how under the scrutiny of the lead-up arguments of this essay it appears even more so than to the otherwise average and impartial reader that hadn't traversed this essay, of Satoshi's sentiments that Satoshi was in fact properly speaking to the question and problem of whether or not Bitcoin satisfies or breaks the intention of Mises Regression Theorem explanation. He gave a good and clear answer that he believes a medium with no non-monetary usefulness can become money, and at least by the way he explains it, as a Zebonian collectible, and this is a reference to an essay by Nick Szabo, Shelling Out the Origins of Money, where he goes over how proto-money is comparable to the concept of collectibles. Previous attempts to construct resolutions of Bitcoin and Mises Regression Theorem. Now we can begin to use our wrapper framework to compress previous inquiries into whether or not Bitcoin violates Mises Regression Theorem and judge whether or not they are valid and useful wrappers. First, we look at the account of Jeffrey Tucker. So this is an essay written by Jeffrey Tucker. And again, our framework provides us with some shortcuts to the computation. Tucker says of the inquiry of whether or not Bitcoin violates Mises Regression Theorem, quote, "At first glance, Bitcoin would seem to be an exception. You can't use Bitcoin for anything other than money. It can't be worn as jewelry. You can't make a machine out of it. You can't wear it, eat it, or even decorate with it. Its value is only realized as a unit that facilitates indirect exchange. And yet Bitcoin already is money. It's used every day. You can see the exchanges in real time. It's not a myth, it's the real deal." Tucker certainly is responding to the inquiry. He also frames it similar to how we feel Mises would approve of it, as well as the Misesian school and the general reader. Then, by our theory, not that we mean to posit something, but rather we will look for this construction. So then by our theory, sincerity, if he had it, would lead him to need to resolve the situation with a construction, and he does in fact attempt to do such a thing. Quote, "How can we resolve this problem? In my mind, I toyed with the issue for more than a year. It puzzled me. I wondered if Mises' insights applied only in a pre-digital age. I followed the speculations online that the value of Bitcoin would be zero but for the national currencies into which it is converted. Perhaps the demand for Bitcoin overcame the demands of Mises' scenario because of a desperate need for something other than the dollar. As time passed, and I read the work of Conrad Graf, Peter Sudra, and Daniel Krawitz, finally the resolution came to me. I will cut to the chase and reveal it. Bitcoin is both a payment system and a money." He wraps Bitcoin in the interface of a payment system, giving it a pre-money, non-monetary usefulness for the market to value. It's hard to see how Mises himself would approve of the idea, however, that a medium could be a payment system that has no other usefulness and yet is not a money. This would seem to erase the distinction that Mises carefully and painstakingly made between a market good or commodity and a money. What a strange solution to admit there is the issue and then to resolve it by saying there is not the issue, Mises might say, and we should be inclined to think that the Mises school would agree. Nonetheless, we see an attempt to resolve the apparent violation. And we should note here, if we go Jeffrey, Tucker, Mises, and we find him highlighted at the Mises Institute. Next section, deconstructing attempts to construct resolutions of Bitcoin and Mises Regression Theorem. Daniel Krawitz, mentioned by Tucker, addressed this inquiry and also made observations on others that Tucker mentioned. Pull up his article. So this is Krawitz on the Nakamoto Institute. Krawitz frames the regression theorem in a familiar way. Quote, "To recap, the regression theorem says, to become a medium of exchange, a thing must be demanded for other reasons. Among a set of competing media of exchanges, one tends to emerge as money." Krawitz's wrapper gives us a nice shortcut. Here's a quote. "An explanation suggested by Graf is that Bitcoins were originally demanded because of an appreciation of Bitcoin's engineering." So Tucker referenced Graf, and Krawitz here is telling us his understanding of Graf. The correct approach, I think, was hinted by Serta, and that is Tucker also referenced Serta, who obliquely says, "According to my opinion, the rational expectations of the potential utility of Bitcoin for the potential buyers exceeds the price demanded by the producers, and trade emerged. Bitcoins would have had value to the person with the right entrepreneurial mindset." This is Krawitz. "A suspicion that Bitcoin might one day be a big deal explains everything about its original demand. This explains how an appreciation of Bitcoin's engineering could lead someone to want the coins themselves. Once it was known that Bitcoin could be sold even for a pittance, new possibilities opened up." Since Krawitz begins the essay by declaring Bitcoin is not and has never been money, then it must be that he's explaining the birth of Bitcoin's pre-money market price. Although he doesn't really resolve the regression theorem, he shortcuts us from having to look at Serta and graph. And Krawitz, if we put him in, is also highlighted on the Mises Institute. Deconstructing Laura Davidson and Walter Block's deconstructing attempts to construct Reyes solutions of Bitcoin and Mises Regression Theorem. That was a little awkward. They're deconstructing the constructions. Laura Davidson and Walter Block give us their wrapper to a familiar explanation of the issue in the abstract of her writing, Bitcoin, the regression theorem, and the emergence of a new medium of exchange. Bring that up. And this is from the Mises Institute. Quote, a recent controversy has brewed over whether or not the emergence of Bitcoin as a new medium of exchange is in accordance with the Mises Regression Theorem. The main question in the debate seems to be, is Bitcoin valued in direct use? The present paper contends, with respect to the regression theorem, this issue has no bearing on Bitcoin's genesis because it is relevant only when a new medium of exchange arises out of pure barter economy. The debate is therefore predicated on a misinterpretation of the theorem. However, the issue of Bitcoin's direct use value, if it has one, does have relevance in assessing the likelihood it will become a generally accepted medium of exchange. More specifically, they contend, quote, this issue has no bearing on Bitcoin's genesis because it is relevant only when a new medium of exchange arises out of a pure barter economy. Without first going into the reasoning, we can say, and expect the general reader to follow, we take issue with this assertion for reason and examples such as Mises' exact wording. Quote, if the objective exchange value of money must always be linked with the pre-existing market exchange ratio between money and other economic goods, since otherwise individuals would not be in a position to estimate the value of the money, it follows that an object cannot be used as money unless, at the moment when its use as money begins, it already possesses an objective exchange value based on some other use. And this comes from the section entitled, quote, the necessity for a value independent of the monetary function before an object can serve as money, as well as this statement, quote, before an economic good begins to function as a money, it must already possess exchange value based on some other cause than its monetary function. Perhaps there is room to argue that in some areas of his writing, Mises didn't mean to assert any and all money must have a non-monetary origin-based market valuation, but rather for just the initial origins of it in general. He does stop to specifically make this point about what he calls fiat and credit money. Quote, this link with the pre-existing exchange value is necessary not only for commodity money, but equally for credit money and fiat money. No fiat money could ever come into existence if it did not satisfy this condition. However, his explanation doesn't really suggest a general acceptance of an unuseful mediums for that which can become what Mises defines as money. Quote, no fiat money could ever come into existence if it did not satisfy this condition. Let us suppose among those ancient and modern kinds of money about which it may be doubtful whether they should be reckoned as credit money or fiat money, there have actually been representatives of pure fiat money. Such money must have come into existence in one of two ways. It must have come into existence because money substitutes already in circulation, that is, claims payable in money on demand, were deprived of their character as claims and yet still used in commerce as media of exchange. In this case, the starting point for their valuation lay in the objective exchange value that they had at the moment when they were deprived of their character as claims. The other possible case that in which coins that once circulated as commodity money are transformed into fiat money by cessation of free coinage, either because there was no further minting at all or because minting was continued only on behalf of the treasury. No obligation of conversion being de jure or de facto assumed by anybody, and nobody having grounds for hoping that such an obligation ever would be assumed by anybody. Here, the starting point for the valuation lies in the objective exchange value of the coins at the time of the cessation of free coinage. Of credit money and fiat money, Mises has said they become money either by 1. It may have come into existence because money substitutes already in circulation, that is, claims payable in money on demand, were deprived of their character as claims and yet still used in commerce as media of exchange. Or 2. The other possible case is that in which coins that once circulated as commodity money are transformed into fiat money by cessation of free coinage, neither of which seem to speak to the origin of Bitcoin. Davidson and Block claim the debate is therefore predicated on a misinterpretation of the theorem, and we can note that at the time of the writing they didn't believe Bitcoin is money. This is a quote from them. However, the issue of Bitcoin's direct use value, if it has one, does have relevance in assessing the likelihood it will become a generally accepted medium of exchange, i.e. money. For the relevant context of the definition of money they provide, what they wrap as Mises' wrapping of Menger. Quote, Menger defines money as the universal medium of exchange, meaning it must be accepted by everyone, while Mises more reasonably maintains it must be generally accepted and commonly used, leaving some room for the possibility that not everyone need be willing to accept it. But no matter which definitional version one chooses, it seems fairly clear that Bitcoin has not yet reached the threshold of either of them. Here we find what they claim to be the deconstruction of others' constructions they parse. Quote, it is important to emphasize that what Mises refers to in this passage is the origin of a new money, de novo, i.e. from a pure state of barter, where there are no existing money prices. To that end, the second part of the regression theorem only explains the genesis of a new money where none existed before. Davidson and Block continue. Quote, after the theory of money and credit was published, a number of economists criticized Mises on the grounds that the theory failed to explain how entirely new paper currencies can replace existing fiat monetary regimes. But these criticisms of Mises were misplaced because they were founded on a misinterpretation of the regression theorem. The theorem does not contend that a new or subsequent money must arise out of a state of barter, nor does it attempt to explain why new monies that have not arisen from barter replace existing ones. It merely implies that in order for the new money to be used in economic calculation, there must be an existing price system in place upon which the new money can be superimposed, which was clearly the case with the Rentenmark. The conclusion of our dual-purpose essay. It is for the general audience and the Mises Institute to decide whether or not Davidson Block have made a proper deconstruction, or rather have wrapped Mises' original intention of the regression theorem in their own interface. But now we have laid grounds to consider a comparison and the relevance to the system or school of Misesian thought with the concepts of Gödel consistency and completeness. In the situation Bitcoin has put the Misesian school in, it is as if they, the school supporters, had asserted their consistency and ran into a contradiction that, although started in nature, ended up allegedly and apparently corrupting the consistency of the system itself. In such a scenario, we would expect to see humans in real time defend their gods, so to speak. We can think of such responses in regard to Szabo's possible synthetic, i.e. merging ideas, based responses. Quote, synthetic construction consists of one or more of the development of a new element that synthesizes traditions, the synthesis of texts or parts of texts into new texts, and new texts which incorporate such synthesis. Whereas Davidson Block might argue they made a proper Szabonian deconstruction, Our argument is they have rather made an interpretation Mises wouldn't so readily go along with, and the Misesian school also won't find definitive consensus on. Our deconstruction suggests that Davidson Bloch's deconstruction is a disguised construction. They have added something to resolve the issue. But this is more for the judges to decide. The dual nature of this essay, or the second useful aspect of it, other than pointing out any reasonable objective inquiry into Mises' regression theorem and the relevant points he makes, would conclude the respective school needs to make a clarifying revision in the face of Bitcoin, whatever that clarifying revision might be. Start that again. The dual nature of this essay, or the second useful aspect of it, is to point out that humans should have a curious nature, and thus history of attempting to find salvation of their religions or systems of thoughts by adding axioms that otherwise prove them undeniably inconsistent. That is to say that by Szabo's account, which we have not explained here, we should expect to find useful deconstructions out of the assumption that humans probably did this constantly throughout humanity, and despite the fact that it was Gödel, later proved it to be incapable of making an inconsistent system consistent. In fact, the Austrian school is in complete disarray because of it. Ask them. The final section. A concluding note on praxeology, the foundation of the Misesian school. And this is a very important section that leads into the second essay in the enumerated series of mine. Mises' theory of human action explains that his school of thought is an extension of praxeology, which he defines here. Quote, "Praxeology is a theoretical and systematic, not a historical science. Its scope is human action as such, irrespective of all environmental, accidental, and individual circumstances of the concrete acts. Its cognition is purely formal and general, without reference to the material content and the particular features of the actual case. It aims at knowledge valid for all instances in which the conditions exactly correspond to those implied in its assumptions and inferences. Its statements and propositions are not derived from experience. They are, like those of logic and mathematics, a priori. They are not subject to verification or falsification on the grounds of experience and facts. They are both logically and temporally antecedent to any comprehension of historical facts. They are a necessary requirement of any intellectual grasp of historical events. Without them, we should not be able to see in the course of events anything else than kaleidoscopic change and chaotic muddle. The theorems attained by correct praxeological reasoning are not only perfectly certain and incontestable like the correct mathematical theorems, they refer, moreover, with the full rigidity of their apodictic certainty and incontestability to the reality of action as it appears in life and history. Praxeology conveys exact and precise knowledge of real things." In a sense, it can be viewed as if it's a system that evolved to state its own consistency. We find that interesting. However, in sincere defense, Mises means to say he means to expound on a system based on logic, such that if done correctly, no empirical observations could disprove it. If this is still unpalatable, just consider the caution that witnessing a phenomenon is only proof so far as a magician can fool an audience. Mises' system means to caution against this, or against making historically based deductions and asserting them as economic laws. For this, it's interesting to consider and very important that Mises would perhaps point out that if the regression theorem has been invalidated, it's not because the existence of Bitcoin. You don't invalidate reason with empirical evidence. But yet we can see how in this context it's still important we have it as an apparent natural counterexample.